Hi, and welcome to this full-on beginner Unity tutorial. As always, I decided to film this intro outside because, why not? In this video, we will be discussing using prefabs, spawning an enemy into our scene, and using the navigation system to make the enemy follow the player and attack it. This is part 2 of the Unity Beginner series. Part 1 is linked in the description, but if you are already comfortable with the topics that were taught in part 1, which are these topics right here, then this video is for you. Also, here are the timestamps in case you are interested in just one part of the video, and I will see you there. Here we go! For this tutorial, I decided to use Unity version 2020.1. If you are still using version 2019, that is completely okay, because everything is the same. The only difference is that the interface will look slightly different. However, if you want to use Unity version 2020, all you're going to have to do is go over to the Installs button in the Unity Hub, click on it, and then you would click on the Add button right here to add a new Unity version, and you would just use any version that you are comfortable with using. I would not suggest using an alpha version because it might be a bit unstable. I would suggest either using beta or any of the regular versions or long-term support. So anyways, on to the tutorial. So we are starting out with this scene right here. Now this scene is where we last left off in the first part of the series. Now, if you are starting off with this part, you don't need this scene to follow along what we are doing. But if you are not as comfortable with things like materials, rigid bodies, colliders, and starting out in Unity in general, then I would highly suggest checking out the first part. Now, moving on to this part. What are we doing in this part? We are going to be spawning in an enemy to chase down the player as it is trying to go to the finish line. And if it catches the player, then the player will lose. So, what do we need to do? We need to create the enemy. So, what do we need to do in this? We have to create a template for the enemy where the enemy is the same thing every time it spawns in, because we don't want the enemy to be different, and we don't want to have a whole bunch of work for us for creating a new enemy every single time. We need to create something called a prefab. Now, what is a prefab? A prefab is basically a template for something, for a more advanced game object that allows you to easily spawn it in at any time without having to recreate it every single time. Now, I did make a video going more in depth into prefabs, but for this video I'm just going to do a brief overview. So to start off, I'm going to hit the plus button here and I'm going to create a cube. So 3D object and then cube. Let's say that this is our enemy right here. This is what is going to be chasing the player around. So I'm just going to scale it up a little bit, maybe make it a little bit bigger. Yeah, there we go. So we have our cube here. I'm just going to rename it here by double clicking. I'm going to rename it enemy, and I'm going to make it red. So let's go into materials here. I'm going to use the red material that we used in the first part. Click and drag, hover over the enemy, and great, now it is red. Now, normally you cannot just create something like this where it's red and it's a cube and it's scaled differently, at least in here, right? There's no option to create one of these. If I were to want to make it again, I would either have to duplicate it or I would have to start all over. With prefabs, the need to do that is eliminated. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to right click here and I'm going to hit create and then folder, and I'm going to type prefabs. Now this is where my prefabs are going to go, in this folder. Now of course you could put them in any folder you want, but just for organization purposes I'm going to put it in this folder. Now if I were to click on the enemy and then drag it over to prefabs and then release, as you can see the prefab has been created, and I can put in as many of these as I want without having to make a new one every single time. If I were to delete all of these enemies, I don't have to start over. I have one right here. I could just drag it in and it works like magic. So this is the instance of the prefab here. So basically we can now edit this prefab and it will edit it for all of them. So this eliminates the need to do a lot of work, which is awesome. Now, what do we need to do now? we are going to spawn in the enemy at the start of the game. And this is going to be doing something called instantiating, which is making an instance of something. So, how do we do this? Well, we have to do this by writing script or code, because we don't have access to the editor, so we can't just drag one in at the start of the game. The player won't have access to that because the player doesn't have Unity, so we have to write a script that will do it for us. So here's what we are going to do. I am going to collapse these folders, and in the scripts folder that we made in the first part, I'm going to right click on it, hover over create, and then select C# script. And I'm going to name this spawn enemy. I'm going to hit enter, and the little spinny wheel will spin for a second. Once it's done, it'll be done, and I'm going to right click on it, and I'm going to click Open C# Project. Now, this is a little bit different from what we did previously. Previously, we would just double click on the script and open it. However, I realized later on that that created a problem, and that problem was that it opened it under the category of miscellaneous files, which means that it wasn't associated with the Unity project, which that's fine. You could still edit the script and it would compile perfectly. But if it's not associated with a Unity project, then that means we won't have all of the nice features like autocomplete and the IntelliSense and all of that stuff. So I'm going to select Open C# Project. I'm going to left click on it. So once Visual Studio is open, we should have access to the script. Now, if the script doesn't show up initially, you can always go back into Unity and then double click on the script. And because we've already opened up the C# project, then the script should appear when you do that. Now, what do we need to do here? At the start of the game, we are going to instantiate the enemy. We're going to spawn in the enemy at the start of the game. So that means we don't need the update method here, because the update method is called every single frame. We're going to get rid of this. We're going to make some space. We are going to be using the start method, because the start method is called once at the start of the game. So what are we going to do? We need to have a reference to our enemy, because we need to let this script know what we are spawning. So I'm going to type public game object and then enemy. So we're going to fill this in later, but this is going to be a reference to our enemy when the game starts. So in void start, I'm going to type in instantiate. Now, what do we do for instantiating things? Well, we need three things in this case. We need to spawn in the object, we need to let it know where to spawn in the object, and we need to let it know what the rotation is. And I'm going to access the documentation just to show you guys specifically what we are looking for here. So I'm going to open up the Unity documentation for instantiate. So this is the documentation for instantiate. We are looking for this version of it right here, where it takes in 3 arguments. So we have the object, the position, and the rotation. There are a whole bunch of other ways that you can use this, but we are going to be using it this way. Now, the documentation is so powerful. I would suggest using this for any new thing that you are doing in Unity. Literally everything. And I will keep recommending that because the documentation is amazing. If we were to go down here, we could see an example of instantiation in action. So, as you can see, we have instantiate and then prefab. Prefab is a reference to a transform up here. We have its position and its rotation, which is just quaternion.identity, which is basically the identity that it has when it spawns in. So we're going to be following this. So I'm going to go back into Visual Studio and I'm going to fill that in. So we are going to say enemy, and then where do we want it to spawn? We want it to spawn at the same spot as the instance to the script. So we are going to say transform.position. And the rotation, we don't really care what the rotation is because it's going to navigate to the player anyway. So I'm going to say quaternion.identity. There we go. So what this script does is that it spawns in the enemy at the start of the game. So I'm going to go back into Unity and let's see if we can make the script work. So we are back in Unity, and we have our newly written spawn enemy script. Now, what do we have to do with this? We have to place it into the scene so that we can spawn the enemy. Now, what am I going to do with this? I'm actually going to make a little spawning pad to spawn in the enemy. Also, I'm using spawn and instantiate interchangeably. They basically mean the same thing. So here we go. I'm going to make little, let's see, I'll make a cylinder, and I'm going to scale it down. I'll just scale a little bit. You don't have to do it this way. This is completely optional as to what you want to do, but I'm just going to do that, and I'm going to make it, let's see, I'm going to make it yellow. No, not yellow actually. Let's make it blue. There we go. It's also an obstacle in this case, I guess. So the enemy is going to instantiate on top of this cylinder right here. So what do I need to do here? Well, let's just name the cylinder. We'll call it spawn pad. And I'm going to create a child for this game object. I'm going to right click and then hit create empty. Now this is an empty game object right here, and I can put this anywhere I want. I'm going to position this to be just above the spawn pad. Now this is where the script is going to be. You can put scripts on anything, literally any object you want. So I'm going to rename this to spawner. Now you can name it whatever you want, but that's what I'm going to name it. I'm going to drag the spawn enemy script onto spawner. So what this does is this will spawn whatever is in here at this position at the rotation of the object. So we need to drag the enemy into this slot right here because we made a public game object. We have to assign it right here. I'm going to go to Prefabs and then enemy. I'm going to drag enemy over here. There we go. So the enemy is now in the script of the spawner, and it's going to spawn here. Now there's a problem already. If I were to click on enemy, you can see that its position is different. This will create a problem at the start of the game. We need this position to be 0, 0, 0, because if we were to spawn it in with the position that we had originally, then that would spawn it in at a different spot, and we don't want that. We want to spawn it in 0, 0, 0 relative to the spawner right here. So let's see what happens when we hit play here. Here we go. I'm going to select maximize on play, and I'm going to hit play. And well, of course the camera is still bound to it. And as you can see, the enemy is now spawned on top of the spawning pad. Awesome. So actually we can adjust this a little bit. Let's see. I'm going to uncheck maximize on play and then hit play. Let's see where it spawns. So the spawner's right here. Okay, there we go. So it still spawns the enemy at the same spot as the spawner. Now the enemy is a little bit beneath, so I'm just going to move the spawner a little bit further up, and let's see what happens. I'm going to hit play. Okay, perfect. So the enemy is now up here. Now the enemy does not have a rigid body on it, nor does it have a collider, so it won't be affected by gravity, but we'll fix that later. So we've managed to spawn in our enemy, but there's a problem, and the problem is that the enemy doesn't really do anything. It's a little boring if you have an enemy that doesn't really do anything, right? So we need to have this enemy follow the player and be moving towards the player at all times. So we have to set up navigation for the enemy, but first we have to write a script that will enable it to target the player in the first place. So what we are going to do is we are going to go into the enemy prefab and we are going to make a new script. Now this script is going to enable the enemy to find the player and move to the player. So I'm going to hit add component, and let's type in enemy, because this is going to be the script that is referred to the enemy. I'm going to make that E capitalized. There we go. Create and add. and that should make a new enemy script. There we go. Now the enemy script is outside of the scripts folder, so I'm going to drag that into the scripts folder so that it is there. There we go. I am going to double click. Once I've double clicked on the script should be up. So what am I going to do? So we need to have a reference to the player because the enemy has to find the player, target the player, and then move towards the player. So I'm going to create a public, and let's just say transform, because we don't need the entire game we don't need the entire game object of the player. We just need to know where the player is, and that's what the transform is. The transform derives from game object, and it's basically just all of the transform data of the player. So the position, the rotation, the scale, all of that stuff. I'm going to select player, or type in player. So what do we need to do? We need to find the player, because here's the problem. We are instantiating the enemy in, which means that the enemy doesn't have any access to the data in the scene. So we have to find the player automatically when it goes into the scene. So what we have to do is we have to put a tag on the player to let the enemy know what the player is. So let's go back into Unity and let's do that. So here is actually proof that you can't put something from the scene into something that is a prefab. So if I were to select enemy here, and we have our newly written script, we have the player here. If I were to try to drag the player into that, as you can see, it won't accept it because it's in the scene and the enemy prefab is in the project. So what we have to do is we actually have to have it find the player automatically by assigning a tag. So I'm going to select the player, and I'm going to go over to the tags here. Now as you can see, we already assigned the player tag to the player. So that is already done for us. So we are going to go back into the enemy script, and we are going to look for the tag of player. Now that we know that the tag is assigned to the player, we're going to go back into the script. Now, if you don't know how to assign a tag to an object, I would heavily suggest going back to the first part of the series and go back to the part where I added the tag to the player. Now, in this, we need to find the player. So we are going to do this. We're going to say player equals game object dot find object with tag, and I'm going to open up parentheses and I'm going to type in player. So this will basically go with this will search all of the objects in the scene for the player tag. Now, as you can see, we have a red line under here. It says cannot implicitly convert type game object into transform, and that's because we are using transform here. So I'm going to say dot transform. There we go. That should get rid of everything. I'm going to save that, and I'm just going to make, well actually I'll keep this public just to show you that it works, but later on we will make this private. Now let's see if this script works. So I'm going to go back into Unity, and as you can see, for the enemy, we have the player here. We don't have to assign anything to this. Let's just hit play and see what happens. So I'm going to hit play, and this should spawn in an enemy here. And if we were to click on the enemy, you can see that it has found the player right here. So it knows exactly what object the player is. Beautiful. So with that done, we can now basically do anything we want, right? So now that we have found the player, we can do navigation. So we are going to use Unity's Navmesh system to have the enemy move over to the player and attack it. Okay, so that's what we are going to do. So before we write the script to get the enemy to move over to the player, we need to set up the navigation first. So we have to set up something called a navmesh. Now what is a navmesh? A navmesh is simply a mesh on your scene that tells navigation agents where they can go and where they can't go. And this is Unity's AI navigation system. So how do we access this navmesh? Well, we have to go to the navigation window, And if you don't have the navigation window, I have the navigation window right here. It is right here. If you don't have it, go over to Window and then AI Navigation, and that should open a navigation window somewhere. So what do we need to do? We need to find all of the navigation static objects in the scene. What in the world does that even mean? Navigation static means that, well, first off, the object is static. Now, what is static? Static means that the object is not moving and it's not affected by physics in any way. For example, this wall here is static because it's not moving and we're not really doing anything with it. So what am I going to do? I'm actually going to select all of the walls here, all of the cylinders. Let's see, all of the cylinders, including the spawn pad. And I'm going to select the ground here, and I'm going to go over to the inspector, and I'm just going to click static. Yes, I'm going to change children. So this essentially makes every single object that we are not interacting with static. Now we are still interacting with these cylinders here, but the cylinders won't be moving. They're not going to be affected by physics in any way. Now, as you can see, it is now building up lighting here, so we don't really want that. That's a whole different thing. If it's doing this for you, we can stop that. So I am going to go over to Window here. It's actually pretty laggy, so it's a good thing that we are getting rid of this. And I'm going to hover over Rendering and then Lighting. And so this is Editor Sorcerer here, and I'm just here to tell you that in this video I'm about to tell you to turn off generate lighting. Now later in the video I actually realized that this is a mistake because the lighting ends up looking all weird. So I'm going to tell you that even though right now I'm telling you to turn off generate lighting, I want you to keep it on and let the lighting generate. So yes, thank you and sorry for that small inconvenience. And we are going to uncheck this auto generate lighting just for simplicity. Now lighting can be a whole nother tutorial, so we are not going to go over lighting in this one. The lighting here is already pretty good anyway. So anyway, as you can see, these objects are now static and we can interact with them for navigation. So I am going to select the objects that we want the enemy to run over and the objects that we don't want the enemy to run over. So for example, this plane right here, we want the enemy to be able to walk on top of the plane. So I'm going to select the plane, and then I'm going to select navigation. And as you can see, we have, for the object tab, we have 4 tabs here. If I were to select the object tab and we had the navigation area to be walkable, well, we're going to keep it that way because we want the enemy to be able to walk on top of the plane, right? So that's good. What we're going to do is we are going to go over to the Bake tab here. We're going to select Bake. Now what happens is this creates a navigation. It already set up most of it for us because it detected which objects we want to be walked on, which objects we don't want to be walked on. Basically what it does is it calculates all of the angles between surfaces. So this angle is a 90-degree angle here, and it detects what surfaces would be good to walk on. Now this blue-green area right here, these are the spots that the enemy can walk on, and everything else are the spots that the enemy cannot walk on. Now we don't want the enemy somehow walking on top of the walls here, so I'm going to select all of the walls. There we go. These are the walls right here, as you can see. Now as you can see, the nav mesh doesn't change unless you rebake it. So if I were to hit bake again, then the nav mesh would go over here. But anyways, let's hit bake again. I have all of our walls selected. I'm going to go over the object and I'm going to select the navigation area to be not walkable because we don't want the enemy to be walking on top of the walls. I'm going to actually, there we go. It wasn't moved back all the way. So I'm going to once again select not walkable. I'm going to select bake, and then I'm going to bake it again. So as you can see, the nav mesh is now not on top of the walls. There we go. And I guess the enemy can stay on top of this. Is this going to be walkable? Yes, it is. Now the nav mesh is a little bit weird in this case. I'm actually going to move this down a little bit. Let's see what happens if I bake again. Yeah, it's still a little weird, but the enemy can still walk on top of it, as you can see right here. So great. We have navigation set up for basic Navmesh agents. Now actually here's another thing. If we had slopes here, so like for example, if I were to create a 3D object, let's make a cube. This is just an example. This is not something that you have to do. Let's say I were to make a slope here, and I were to hit the rotate tool, and I were to do something like this. Yeah, so let's say that there was a little slope here, and if I were to hit bake, well actually this would have to be static. There we go. And it would be walkable. If I were to hit bake, it would accommodate for the slope here. Now let's say that I didn't want the enemy to go up any slope at all. So I would navigate to the bake category to select the max slope that we want it to bake at. So if I were to bring this all the way down to 0 and I were to hit bake, then as you can see, it would get rid of the slope right here. So that's what happens if you want to accommodate for sloping. Now if I were to move this to 60, this would be the max slope. We don't have any 60-degree slopes here, but if I were to hit bake, as you can see, it accommodates for it. And also it fixes the slope here. Even though this is a 90-degree slope, it still does some interpolation for sloping, so we have that covered. So I'm going to get rid of this right here, and I'm going to re-hit bake so that it brings it back to what we were doing. Actually, it brought this back to the weird mesh again. That's a bit odd, but I don't think it's going to affect anything. Yes, so basically we have the navigation. Now, we have to set it so that the enemy can use this navigation, because it's not useful if the enemy can't use it, right? So we're going to go back to the inspector, and I'm going to select enemy here. Now, what do we need for this? What do we need for the enemy to interact with our nav mesh that we just set up? We need to create a Navmesh agent, and this allows it to interact with it. So I'm going to do agent, Navmesh agent right here. And here we go. So we have the Navmesh agent. In the enemy script, we have to reference the Navmesh agent. So I'm going to go back to the enemy script, and we are going to do this. We have to import a new library. So we are going to say using Unity Engine .ai, and this will allow us to reference Navmesh agents and everything Navmesh related. So we are going to say private Navmesh agent. So now that we have created our Navmesh agent reference, we can now assign it down here. Now I made it private because we can just access it through the code. So I'm going to say agent equals get component, and then I'm going to say Navmesh agent. That will be the type. So parentheses and then a semicolon right here. This line right here will search in our game object and get the Navmesh agent component. Now, what are we going to do? What are we going to do with this Navmesh agent? We are going to use it to target the player and move towards it. So let's just test this out. I'm going to say agent, down in the update method that is, I'm going to say agent.set destination, and I'm going to say player.position. Now this makes it so that it moves itself over to the position of the player at the moment. So I'm going to save this. Whoops. I'm going to save this. Oh yeah, also this happens in the update method, which means that this is called every single frame. The position is updated every single frame, which means that if the player moves, the enemy will move towards that updated position. So I'm going to go back into Unity and let's test this out and see what happens. So I'm actually going to delete this enemy right here because we don't need it. A new enemy is going to spawn here anyway, so I'm going to hit play and let's see what happens, shall we? There we go. The enemy is now slowly but surely moving over to the player. There we go. Now, as you can see, the enemy does not do anything when it runs into the player, but we will fix that shortly. So you might have noticed that when I played the scene previously, the scene got darker, and that was actually because I actually had to generate lighting. Now, I know that I said previously that you did not have to generate lighting because it wouldn't affect the scene. It seems like in this case it does, and that is because when we made our objects static, we made it light map static, which means that it will be affected by baked lighting. Now, once again, that's a more complicated topic, so we could talk about that in a later tutorial, but I would just say you should generate lighting if you are making objects static. Now, if you only wanted to make objects navigation static, then that is a different case. But anyways, with that said and done, we are now going to go over to the certain features that you can use within a Navmesh agent. Now, basically, there are a whole bunch of features that you can use. There's speed, angular speed, acceleration, and stopping distance. Those are mostly the 4 things that you would have to worry about, but we'll go over all of them. So if I were to go to Enemy and then click on Open Prefab, you will see that this is able to edit the prefab. So these 4 parameters, you can't see the result of them until you actually play the game, but basically the speed is how fast the Navmesh agent goes. The angular speed is how fast the Navmesh agent turns. The acceleration is how fast it goes from stopping to its maximum speed. And the stopping distance is how far away you want the Navmesh agent to be from its target before it stops. So that's what that is there. And we can just leave these as they are right now. As far as obstacle avoidance, the radius and height do matter in this case. As you can see, the Navmesh agent did a pretty good job at automatically sizing it, but if you wanted to adjust the height and radius, you could do that right here. Now, basically, things that the enemy cannot walk on cannot go within this thing right here. It's kind of like a collider, if you think of it that way. You can adjust the radius. In this case, we don't have to do that right now. We have the quality, we'll just set that to high quality, and priority, we can just leave that as is. Pretty much everything here, we can just leave it as is. The only other thing that you might want to know about is the base offset, and this basically affects the height at which your Navmesh agent is at. So with all of this in place, you can adjust this as much as you want for your own game, but we can leave it as is. Now, pretty much the last thing that we need to do is we need to make it so that when the enemy runs into the player loses. But first off, this obstacle course is a little bit too impossible, because if we were to play the game right now, you could see that when the ball starts to move, well, if I can get the ball to avoid that, as you can see, the enemy just automatically goes into the player, and it's pretty much impossible for the player to get through this one little area without the enemy automatically going towards the player. So I'm just going to adjust this scene a little bit just to make it a little bit easy for the player. So I adjusted the obstacle course a little bit, and as you can see, there are a couple of things that are a little bit weird. There's some weird shadow artifacts here. We are going to have to rebake the lighting for our static objects. But first though, if we were to go into navigation, you could see that the navigation is all off now. Some of the objects are still in the same place as they once were, but if I were to move them, you could see that navigation has not been baked to the current setup. So I'm just going to click on Bake. There we go. And then I'm going to go into Lighting. Now, once again, if you don't have the Lighting tab, you would go to Window, Rendering, and then Lighting. Click on Lighting, and I would click on Generate Lighting. Now, this might take a few minutes for you, so I will resume the tutorial when the baking has been done. So the lighting has now been baked, so everything is now just as it was before I changed up the level. Now I also changed up a couple of other things. I made it so that the camera no longer follows the player. So from our first tutorial, I made it so that the camera follows the player. I unchecked that. I just did that because the map has gotten pretty big and we need to see where the enemies are as well as the player. I also made it so that when the player gets destroyed by either the trash cans or from the enemy in the future, it will spawn, it will transport itself back here. So you would just have to go into the rolling ball script and change the coordinates to whatever you have up here. And but I'm not going to show that in this tutorial, but essentially now what we need to do before we make the enemies affect the player is we need to do something. I'm going to make the spawn pad a prefab, and I'll show you why in a second. So I'm going to drag this into prefabs, and I'm going to set the position to 0, 0, 0. And now let's say you want multiple spawn pads, and let's say you don't want to create a different one, and you could always just duplicate it, but another way is to make it a prefab and then to just drag it out again so that you have another one. So I'm just going to have 2 spawn pads and I'm going to drag it out here. There we go. So let's play test this scene and see what happens. So the ball is right here. We have 2 enemies spawning now, and as you can see, I can easily make it to the end here. So maybe we can make it so that this spawn pad is blocking this right here. How fun would that be? So now the player has to do some crazy maneuvers in order to reach the end. Let's see what we can do here. So, let's see, this is going to be a bit risky. Aha! So, I'm not sure if I can go that way. Oh, well, I guess that's one way of doing it. Alright, so I should probably make it so that and then that works. I should probably make it so that the player cannot run over the spawn pads, because then the player will just run out of the map. So let's do that. So this is exactly what the spawn pad prefab is meant for. If I wanted to edit both of them, I can just open prefab, and I'm going to get rid of the capsule collider here because I don't want the player to be able to run on top of it. That is perfect. So now that change now saved for both of the spawn pads here. As you can see, neither of them have a collider on them. So if I were to hit play and we were to try to roll over one of the spawn pads, I just have to make it to one of them. Let's see. So, yep. So as you can see, the player is not affected by the spawn pad. Uh-oh. Well, we haven't done anything with the enemy yet, so the enemy doesn't do anything. Yeah, but as you can see, the player is not affected by it. Awesome. So now the last thing that we have to do is make it so that when the enemy runs into the player, it does the same exact thing as this trash can right here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a look at this trash can script and see what we have. So we have so we have the on trigger enter, and if the tag is the player tag, you lose. It moves it back to the original starting point, and it sets its velocity to 0. So, okay, this is pretty much the exact same script that we need for the enemy. Now, here's the thing. We need to put a trigger collider on the enemy. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to go back into it. I made some minor changes, so it saved the script. I'm going to go into the enemy prefab, and I'm going to open the prefab, and we are going to literally just add the trash can script. Now, I should have given this a more generic name. I should have known in the first tutorial, but this enemy is basically just going to be a moving trash can. Alright, so we already have a box collider. Let's just make this a trigger. And that should essentially be all that we need in order to get it to work. So let's go back and let's see what happens. So if I were to hit play, let's see. Okay, I'll move the mouse out of the way. And beautiful. So the enemy now attacks the player. Now, here is something that we want to happen. the enemy currently stays in place when it defeats the player. See? So if this were to just keep happening, let's say the scene were really, really hard, this would essentially just keep happening, and that would essentially make the game unplayable. So there's a fix for this. We actually need to reload the scene, okay? So basically, with reloading the scene, that's essentially the same as hitting the start button again, or the play button. When you hit the play button again, basically the entire scene resets and the enemies are back to where they were previously. So we are actually going to edit the trash can script, and we are going to make it so that instead of just moving the player back and setting the velocity to 0, 0, 0, we're just going to reset the scene. Now, for resetting the scene, we need a new library. So we are going to say using Unity Engine.scene management. Okay, so we are just going to get rid of all of this. We could still, well, actually we don't need the you lose thing because we already know that it works, right? So we're going to say scene manager, and I believe it was load scene. Okay, now we need to know what the name of our scene is. So we're going to go back in here and we're going to see what the name of the scene was. Now there's a couple of things that was set up for some other scenes, but basically the scene is called sample scene. Okay, so we're going to go back into Visual Studio and I'm going to call this sample scene. Now this has to be in a string because it searches for a string. All right, beautiful. So we have this working. Now what should happen is the scene should reload when the player hits something. Let's test this out. So let's see. So the scene started, I'll run into a trash can. Awesome. So the scene restarted when I run into a trash can. Let's see the enemy. There we go. Awesome. So actually, I'm going to do the same thing for when the player, yeah, there we go. I'm going to do the same thing for when the player runs into the yummy cube, because currently if the player runs into the yummy cube, nothing happens. We said that the player won previously, but essentially nothing happens, and there's really nothing that happens. I'm going to set up basically the base for you to do whatever you want. So let's see what script is attached to this. We have the cheese cube. I'm going to hit 3 dots, edit script. Okay, so instead of just destroying the game object, we're going to do the same thing as in trash can. So basically, in trash can, I'm going to just copy this, paste it in there, trash can, and we're just going to load the scene again. And the reason why I said that we're setting up a base is because you can load any scene you want. So if there's a scene where there's like a victory scene and you won and you make that scene, you can essentially just put that scene in there and it'll work very well. So okay, so I saved that and let's see what happens. Essentially the same thing should happen, but we're just going to test it and we are going to see what happens. All right. Oh, I don't know how I managed to mess that up. Let's go this way this time. Whoa, okay. All right, so that worked. Awesome. All right, so the scene resets, but as I said, you can do whatever you want with this. You can load a new level. You can do a whole bunch of things. So there we go. That is it for this tutorial. This was the second phase or the second episode of this tutorial. I really hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope you got a lot out of this. Please let me know if you want me to continue with this tutorial. There are obviously a lot of things that we can do with this, while at the same time teaching you the basics of Unity. So anyways, that was that, and I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.